I would like to introduce you to tonight's presenter, Katrina Walker. Katrina hails from Lakewood, Ohio, and is a 2017 graduate of Sarah Lawrence College in Bronxville, New York. Her areas of study there were in theater and history. Prior to coming to the Oberlin Heritage Center, she was the education intern for the Cleveland Botanical Gardens and the Cleveland Museum of Art. Katrina also has more than a dozen years of theater experience in both professional and community theaters across Northeast Ohio. Katrina has been with the Oberlin Heritage Center since last October, and she is serving as the Ohio History Service Corps member. As part of her AmeriCorps program service, Katrina has dedicated half of her time at the Heritage Center, assisting with tours and special projects, including several highlighting the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. The other half of her time is spent with other local history organizations in Lorain County and in neighboring communities in a 5-county region. And she helps these small museums and historical societies with professional assistance and capacity building projects. And as we move toward the end of her service, unfortunately, this September, we are proud to have hosted her here in Oberlin, and we look forward to not only her presentation this evening, but for her future educational and professional endeavors as she begins graduate school at American University this fall. So everybody, welcome Katrina, and whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Great, thank you, Amanda. Good evening. I am so pleased to be able to share my research with all of you this evening. This presentation is a culmination of my research over the past months through my service as a local history member of the Ohio History Service Corps and AmeriCorps program. Give me just a moment. Okay. Opportunities Abroad, examining the experiences of 4 female African-American Oberlin College graduates in Western Europe. Oberlin College holds a unique position in the history of higher education in the United States. As the first college to admit women, the first to admit African-Americans, and the first to confer a bachelor's degree to women. With this presentation, I will be exploring the paths of 4 African-American women who attended Oberlin and thereafter went on to find a degree of success abroad, specifically in Western Europe, that was either denied to them in the United States or arguably impeded and hampered by prejudice. I will be presenting each of their stories in somewhat chronological order to help underline that despite their experiences spanning the decades, they continue to face challenges even as slow progress was made in the United States. I'm probably going to reiterate this numerous times, but each of these women and their work have been incredibly difficult to sum up in only a few minutes each. So I hope you will be forgiving of the license I have taken to attempt to be brief, and to best represent this pattern of Oberlin African-American female graduates going, quote, across the pond to find success and further their education and careers. We're going to begin with Edmonia Lewis, who is widely regarded as the first world-renowned African-American and American Indian female sculptor. She was born between 1843 and 1845, roughly, with many marking her birthday as July 4th, 1844, and typically locating her family in upstate New York. Her father was a free Afro-Haitian, and her mother was a Ojibwe Indian. After the death of both her parents at a young age, Lewis was adopted by her mother's relatives and grew up observing her family's Ojibwe culture, going by the name Wildfire. Her half-brother provided funds for her to attend a Baptist abolitionist school in New York State. She described this period of her life later as, quote, until I was 12 years old, I led this wandering life, fishing and swimming and making moccasins. I was then sent to school for 3 years, but was declared to be wild. They could do nothing with me. She first attended the preparatory department of Oberlin College beginning in 1859, and it is at this time she begins to go by the name Mary Edmonia Lewis. While women were welcomed at Oberlin College, The kind of education they received differed from the education of their male classmates for many decades. Female students studied under the Young Ladies Department, whose requirements did not include courses in Hebrew, Greek, Advanced Latin Language, and Literature. To supplement the courses not offered by this department, French, drawing, poetry, and modern literature were added. While at Oberlin, Lewis excelled at her studies. She resided along with a number of other women in the home of Reverend John Keep, an abolitionist and trustee of the college who rented out rooms in his home. Unlike her classmates, Lewis had not been brought up with the same kinds of Victorian values. Additionally, her identity as African-American and American Indian seems to have often put her in an outsider status, even in a more integrated community like Oberlin. In the winter of 1862, she was accused of poisoning 2 white female classmates. The women, fellow boarders at Keep House and friends of Lewis, were said to have been poisoned by Spanish fly, an aphrodisiac, that had been added to mulled wine that Lewis is alleged to have prepared and served. The 2 friends drank the wine before they had planned to go for a sled ride with 2 young men later that day. Despite a lack of evidence, when her 2 classmates fell ill shortly after, Lewis was accused of poisoning her friends. While the 2 women recovered, and Lewis was believed and protected by influential authorities at the college, such as Reverend Keep and the head of the ladies' department, Mary Ann Parker Dascom, Lewis was eventually arraigned. The trial, which would go on to take place for 6 days, between February and March of 1862, was delayed due to a brutal attack on Edmonia Lewis. One account claimed that Lewis had been severely injured by being pushed on the ice while skating. John Mercer Langston had a different recollection, remembering that Lewis was kidnapped from near her boarding house after dark, taken to an empty field outside of town, and severely beaten by what have sometimes been described as white vigilantes, who were not aligned with the broader abolition and tolerance of Oberlin. He recalls that her clothing and jewelry were taken and she was left for dead, only being found after a community-wide search was begun when her disappearance was noted. Her injuries were serious, and Langston, who had agreed to take on her case pro bono, was able to secure a delay in the trial. When the case was called, Lewis is reported to have been carried into the courthouse in the arms of her friends. It is unclear if this was due to her injuries or to show their support of her. The case was eventually won by Langston, primarily due to lack of evidence and without Lewis having to take the stand. He remembered her being carried out of the court, quote, in the arms of her excited associates and fellow students, fully vindicated in name and character. Despite the acquittal, Lewis did not remain in Oberlin. A year after the trial, she was accused of stealing art supplies, despite, again, a lack of evidence. Most sources agree that despite her support for Lewis during the trial, Marian Parker Dascom did not allow Lewis to enroll for her final semester. Other sources claim that she chose to leave Oberlin to pursue her eventual career as a sculptor, with some even claiming that it was Frederick Douglass himself who encouraged her to head east to Boston. It is around this time that she appears to drop Mary from the beginning of her name, primarily being known as Edmonia Lewis from then on. In leaving Oberlin, Lewis found success, supporters, and patrons among the abolitionist community around Boston. With their assistance and the sales of some of her earliest pieces, Lewis is able to mount a trip to Europe. She traveled to London, Paris, and Florence before finding an artistic community of fellow American expats in Rome. Other American sculptors gravitated towards Rome at this point, attracted not only by the artistic history of the city, but by the ready availability of marble and skilled craftsmen who were experienced at transforming the plaster models of an artist into a finished work of art. The artistic style of this group favored a neoclassical approach that leaned heavily on Greco-Roman inspiration. This can be seen across Lewis's work, but an American and Native American influence is clearly present across some of her surviving work. I've chosen to include a few of her pieces here. This is Portrait of a Woman, marble, 1873. The Death of Cleopatra, marble 1876, which is part of the collection of the Smithsonian American Art Museum. If you're an art history buff, I would encourage you to look into the history of this sculpture. It's particularly interesting. A bust of James Peck Thomas, marble 1874, which is held by the Allen Memorial Art Museum in Oberlin. And Indian Combat, marble 1868, collection of the Cleveland Museum of Art, acquired in 2011. In Rome, she picks up Italian easily and quickly made a success of herself among the other American artists living there. She was unique among them not only in her background, but in her decision to primarily work without the assistance of local workmen. One source quotes Lewis as saying of her studies and success in Rome, quote, "I was practically driven to Rome in order to obtain the opportunities for art culture, and to find a social atmosphere where I was not constantly reminded of my color. The land of liberty had no room for a colored sculptor." End quote. I would argue that Lewis becomes quite good at harnessing her identity as a way to distinguish herself and her art from her contemporaries, both in print and in person. In America, her status as an outsider often presented barriers. But in Rome, it is exotic. Her outsider status propels her beyond her work, which is often consistent in theme and quality with other artists of the day. I truly could spend this entire presentation discussing the ways that Edmonia Lewis herself both used the constructs of gender, race, and identity, and has been used as a lens for these ideas by those who wish to support her work and those who wish to detract from it. Lewis consistently changes what kind of narrative she projected, and we see at the height of her fame a startling number of varying accounts of her past, both by her and other contemporaries. This lack of clarity on her life and background make Lewis something of an enigma. What is not in doubt, however, is the effect that moving to Europe has on Lewis. She never again resides full-time in the United States, primarily being based in Rome, but also living in Paris, and eventually, at the time of her death in 1907, in London. This is her newly restored grave, which was restored via a crowdfunding campaign in 2017. For a long time, it was sort of unclear even when and where she had died. So this discovery and the restoration is very exciting. So we're going to move forward in time to Mary Burnett Talbert. Born in Oberlin in 1866, Mary was raised in Oberlin, going through the Oberlin City Schools. This is an image from the Oberlin Heritage Center collection of downtown Oberlin, West College Street, about 1875 to 1880. Mary's father, Cornelius Burnett, was a local business owner whose shop was located roughly where Black River Cafe is today on South Main Street in Oberlin. She attended Oberlin College, graduating in 1866, and went on to become a teacher. She married William Talbert in 1891. William and Mary were both involved in the early meetings of the Niagara Movement, the early stages of what would become the NAACP. A full account of Talbert's national activism would take up another Zoom call entirely, so I will attempt to be brief here. A board member of the NAACP, an advocate for their anti-lynching efforts, and an early proponent of historic preservation, she was actually instrumental in saving the Frederick Douglass home in Maryland. Talbert also served as the 4th president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, an organization co-founded by former Oberlin classmate Mary Church Terrell. During World War I, she worked with the Red Cross as a nurse in France. Talbert's work on voting rights and civil rights earned her national recognition. As her domestic profile grew, so did her international reputation. During her tenure as president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, she represented the organization at the 5th meeting of the International Council of Women in Christiania, Norway in 1920. Christiania is now known as Oslo. She was the first official African-American delegate to the conference. This trip abroad is of particular interest to this topic. An account of the trip is published shortly afterwards in The Crisis, the official magazine of the NAACP. Talbert and her daughter traveled with her alternate delegate, as well as women who the Crisis described as, quote, 5 Southern-born white women, who are characterized over the course of the 78-day trip as making the lives of Talbert, her daughter, and alternate delegate, quote, as uncomfortable as possible, end quote. The article recounts the efforts to segregate the white and black members of the delegation led by the Southern delegates. One of the women even goes to the proprietor of a local hotel in Antwerp and requests the segregation between the Southern white delegates and Talbert, her daughter, and alternate delegate, but is refused by the proprietor. Other incidents occur where the Southern women refuse to eat or even attend events where Talbert and her companions are welcomed. A particularly controversial incident occurs in Paris when the African-American members of the party are reputedly refused service at the YWCA in Paris. The YWCA later refutes the claim, insisting that there was a miscommunication in reservations, not discrimination, and insinuating that Talbert is overreacting or misinterpreting the incident. An unattributed document held by the W.E.B. Du Bois collection recounts the life and accomplishments of Talbert. Cursory comparison of the handwriting of these documents with documents held by Oberlin College that we know Talbert to have written lead me to believe that this document could have been written by Talbert herself, or possibly dictated by her, as it is dated when her health is beginning to fail. The Paris incident is actually recounted in this document, with the author writing, quote, was insulted in Paris, France, by an American YWCA hostess at an American club, flying an American flag, en route to conference where she was not only delegate, but one of the speakers in the Storting. The Storting is roughly translated to the Great Assembly, and it is Norway's supreme legislative body. So particularly impressive. The prejudice Talbert receives abroad from the Southern women mirrors similar discrimination she faced when her participation as a speaker for an event organized by Alice Paul is turned down due to concerns about alienating the Southern wing of the suffrage movement. At the conference, they report being treated with every courtesy by other foreign officials and delegates, and with respect by the 2 American officials, contrasting their treatment by the other American delegates. Talbert, while in Norway, publishes 4 articles on issues of race in America in 2 of the major papers of Christiana. Lady Aberdeen, pictured, a social activist and advocate for women's rights, was the president of the council and hosts the American delegation at her home, Haddow House in Aberdeen, Scotland, on their way home. At one of the events, Lady Aberdeen requests that Talbert be seated in the place of honor at her right, and the American Jewish representative be seated on her left. After this trip, Talbert is a regular correspondent with some of the hosts, including members of the royal families of Belgium and Norway and Lady Aberdeen. Sadly, Talbert's work for social causes is cut short with her death in 1923, just a year after she becomes the first woman to be awarded the Spingarn Medal, the highest honor awarded by the NAACP. The prejudice Talbert received abroad from the Southern women mirrors similar discrimination she faced when her participation as a speaker backwards. With the majority of her papers lost, it is difficult to discern what effect her international experiences had on Talbert, but she clearly took great pride in her inclusion in the International Council and was particularly upset about the treatment she had received abroad from the other Americans. A classmate of Talbert, Dr. Anna Julia Cooper's own European experiences own European experiences contrast with continued American discrimination, but centers around the academic. Born into slavery in 1858, Anna Julia Cooper is perhaps the most prolific of the women profiled. Occasionally referred to as the mother of Black feminism, Cooper's ideas and influence extended across the Atlantic and back. Cooper attended Oberlin for her undergraduate degree, graduating in 1884, and became one of the first Black women to obtain a master's degree, earning her MA in mathematics from Oberlin in 1887. Cooper found success in a number of different areas, in writing and as an educator. In 1892, along with Mary Church Terrell and other DC American social activists, Cooper was a founding member of the Colored Women's League, a precursor to the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. Cooper worked as a teacher and a principal at M Street School, one of the country's first African-American high schools. A lifelong learner, in the summers of 1911 to 1913, she took courses in French history and literature in Paris. Following in the footsteps of her contemporaries, fellow Oberlin graduates and African-American female educators like Fanny Jackson Coppin and Mary Church Terrell, who had undertaken study abroad opportunities in Europe. Cooper had been abroad before as a speaker at the first Pan-African Conference in London. With barriers to success rampant in academia in the United States for African Americans, Cooper was among a large contingent of students flocking to Paris and London and other parts of Europe, both pre and post World War I. In 1914, Cooper began work on her doctorate at Columbia University, but her studies were interrupted when she adopted 5 of her nieces and nephews. Her original thesis was a translation of an epic poem about Charlemagne that she would later assert was, quote, written to, quote, pay homage to the Oberlin tutors who taught her French and, quote, to do a favor to American students by facilitating the study of an important and rather rare text. Despite the positive reviews it received in Paris and the American academic community viewing it as a significant scholarly contribution, Cooper faced similar challenges to other African American women in academia at the time. Even when their work was deemed excellent and important, they had difficulty getting published. Even Oberlin, vocally proud of this accomplished alumna, refused to publish the thesis. Over the course of the next decade, Cooper worked during the school year and spent her summers studying and researching, transferring some of her Columbia credits to the Sorbonne in Paris. Her next and final thesis, The Attitude of the French on the Question of Slavery between 1789 and 1848, was written in French, in a Paris apartment that had no electricity, so no heat or light, and on an American typewriter, meaning that Cooper had to painstakingly enter in the French punctuation by hand. Cooper successfully defended her dissertation in Paris in March of 1925, despite a particular disagreement with one of the committee members on what he called her partisan pleading, quote, tone of activism. She became the 4th African-American woman and the first African-American woman from DC to receive her PhD. She was honored with this U.S. postal stamp in 2009. So the final woman whose story I will be sharing this evening is one I am particularly excited to share. Ruth Anna Fisher was born in Lorraine in 1886 to an Oberlin Preparatory School graduate and Lorraine real estate investor and businessman David C. Fisher. At Oberlin, Fisher lived in Talcott Hall and was a member of the Ladies Literary Society. She can be seen here on the far right, 3rd row from top. And here there's a close-up of this image, but she's second from right on the 2nd row from the bottom. She took courses both at the college and at the conservatory, graduating in 1906. After graduating from Oberlin, Fisher teaches at Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute for a few months. She was dismissed after allegedly having a disagreement on pedagogy and the school's insistence that she teach Sunday school. After this dismissal, she returns to Lorraine. Over the next decade and a half, Fisher teaches in Lorraine, Indiana, and West Virginia, studies at the Canadian Academy of Music, and takes charge of a YWCA in Harlem, New York at the end of World War I. Through these years, she appears intermittently involved in social activism, speaking out against the screening of a racist film in Lorraine, and even attaching her name to an article advocating for birth control in 1916. In 1920, when a benefactor offers to pay for a year of study abroad to continue Fisher's education, she accepts and enrolls in classes at the London School of Economics. While abroad in London, Fisher was advised to meet with historian and one of the founders of the American Historical Association, J. Franklin Jameson. Jameson interviews Ruth and thus begins a partnership that will last till Jameson's death in 1937. He enlists her help with his work as director of the Carnegie Institution, and when he moves over to become the chief of the manuscripts division at the Library of Congress, Ruth is brought along as an assistant, but remains in London. She works on locating and supervising the copying of documents from the collections of the British Museum and the British Parliament and the Public Records Office. She claims to have been the first foreigner to be given a key to the British Museum and one of the first women. Jameson is an ardent supporter of Fisher, once positively, but somewhat patronizingly describing her to a fellow historian as having, and I quote, the proper delicacy about the color line, but highly intelligent and educated Negroes have so hard a pathway in America. I want her to have what pleasure she can in Europe, end quote. He raises funds for her to pursue her passions outside of history. She trains as an opera singer in London between 1931 and 1932, but her musical aspirations are cut short by an operation to her goiter. A contemporary of Fisher's from the Library of Congress describes her in an article in the year after her death as having, quote, a passion for music, literature, and languages, especially Latin, politics, sparkling conversation, cats, and gourmet cooking. It is unclear from my research who exactly referred Ruth to Jameson and thus changed the trajectory of her career and her life, but it doesn't seem outlandish to suppose that it was W.E.B. Du Bois, the influential American sociologist and historian and a founder of the NAACP. A collection of letters held by the W.E.B. Du Bois collection at University of Massachusetts Amherst provides an illuminating look at a professional and friendly correspondence that lasted for over 5 decades. From 1909 to 1961, they carry on a correspondence that waxes and wanes, discussing the mundane to the consequential. Recurring topics included the most pressing political issues of the day, plans for the second and third Pan-African Conference held in Europe, and their own historical research. That affinity for sparkling conversation is very evident. She rebukes Du Bois teasingly on more than one occasion for writing letters that she has deemed too short, and her sense of humor shines through when she's asked to describe herself for her possible profile in The Crisis, the magazine of the NAACP. She described herself as, quote, a stout middle-aged woman, hopefully not too much so, and writes something that is a little hard to discern about how her white Persian cat qualifies her for spinsterhood. She never married. She remains in London, with a few apparent trips back to the States, until 1940. Even after Britain has declared war, Fisher remains. I would argue that Fisher would have remained in London if not for the bombing of her apartment. She finds Washington, D.C. a world away from her life in London. And compares it to the rise, and compares what she sees to the rise of nationalism in Germany in an incredibly prescient way. Quote, "I hate Washington with an intense hatred. I see no difference here between the Japanese and Prussian military caste and the Southern oligarchy here. They are all convinced of their race superiority, and they control the army and the navy. The Ku Klux Klan is like the stormtroopers, and all of these groups want to make their opinions the predominant and powerful ones in their respective countries and the world, with all else subservient to them. It further seems as likely for Hitler to arise here in these circumstances as in Germany." End quote. She certainly devotes a lot of ink and paper in her letters throughout the 1940s with W.E.B. Du Bois trying to get back to London. When she does go back, she writes that she felt she had never left, although she does request that on his next visit to London, could W. Du Bois please bring her some of her American hair products. Apparently those were scarce in post-World War II London. After completing the project, she is sent back to London in 1949 to finish. She returns to DC in 1952. She continues to work for the Library of Congress, preparing the guides for the numerous manuscripts that she unearthed abroad. She writes a biographical article with colleagues on her mentor Jameson that is published in 1952. In that article written by one of her Library of Congress contemporaries, the writer asserts that while Fisher did not generally participate in public protesting, she, quote, "felt it her duty at age 77 to participate in the historical March on Washington in 1963, where Martin Luther King delivered his I Have a Dream speech. Whether she felt it her duty as an African-American woman or as a historian or both is unclear." The same author also writes that, quote, "although she never overtly called attention to her ethnic identity, she had a pride for her Afro-American background, a pride that required no touting. She simply refused to let race or any other artificially imposed distinction impinge upon her being, Ruth Anna Fisher, person." The author writes that, quote, "the general acceptance of her and her own merits as an Afro-American in Great Britain, both before and after World War II, could hardly have been paralleled in this country until the 1960s, if then." The opportunity to prove herself abroad, as colleagues from the Library of Congress would later describe her as a marvelous scholar and a woman of the greatest dignity of anyone I have ever known, away from the evident prejudices she would have faced attempting to pursue that same career in the United States, cannot be overstated. She was praised for her ability to find the most obscure documents. I hope that she might perhaps find the humor in my research into her work and life coming from a range of obscure documents in obscure places. She died in 1974 with an obituary published in the Washington Post. It is hard to draw a definite conclusion with the evidence and stories I have shared with you. Perhaps these women would have found success no matter where they lived and worked. It is difficult to say with any certainty that these women would have achieved less if they had stayed in the United States. But by seeking and obtaining opportunities in Europe, they were privileged to be able to experience a culture that lacked some of the formal and informal segregation of America that was upheld by law. That is not to say they did not experience prejudice or racism abroad, but all four undoubtedly benefited from a token or novelty factor. These women benefited not only from their status as Americans, but from the European fascination with Blackness. They found opportunities in the metropolises of Europe, that although they were not devoid of racism, lacked much of the overtness and institutionalization of structural racism in the United States. I sincerely hope you have enjoyed this evening's presentation. Following the trail of these women has been one of the most engaging research projects I have ever undertaken, and I hope to be able to continue my research, particularly into the life of the enigmatic Ruth Anna Fisher in future. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina. So just a reminder that if you'd like to ask Katrina a question or have any input of your own, you may use the Zoom group chat function, or you may turn on your video and or audio and maybe raise your hand. There's a feature down below with the reactions, raise your hand, and that way we can call on people so that there's not multiple individuals trying to ask a question at once. And then also I'm going to be putting in the link for the feedback. Again, we would greatly appreciate your thoughts to help us improve our programs. So there it is there.
I see Caitlin Donaldson has asked, could you talk more about some of your sources? I can go back to sharing my screen. I have 2 slides of works cited pages. Between all 4 women, there were quite a few.
It looks like Camille also has a question regarding Edmonia Lewis. As to, she said Edmonia left Oberlin. Could you speak more about the circumstances surrounding Edmonia not being in Oberlin and going to Boston?
Yeah, so she is encouraged, it's unclear by who, possibly Frederick Douglass, when she is unable to graduate. She's accused of stealing those art supplies, and the head of the ladies department at the time denies her re-enrollment into the program, so she's unable to graduate. I'm not sure if she would technically be a graduate, but in that case, so she did attend, but she did not graduate since she was unable to enroll for her final semester. So, but she is, I mean, and she's still technically attended. She did attend. Do we have any other questions?
Well, Katrina, this is Liz. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
I haven't asked you this, but like, what was one of your favorite finds, your favorite source that you came across? And then another question did come in, just so you know.
I saw. Okay, I'll answer both of those. So I can kind of answer this both at the same time, actually. So Fisher is really, she was very hard to track down. It really wasn't all in one place. And actually, the Wikipedia page about her was actually created by some amateur historians who I got into contact with, trying to find out more about her. They got really inspired by her story and helped research and find a bunch of sources that I hadn't even discovered, including that passport application photo. And they published over Martin Luther King Day weekend of this past year, that Wikipedia page about Fisher. So I want to know how her letters to and from W.E. Du Bois ended up in that collection, because you would have thought a lot of her stuff would have been destroyed in that bombing in 1940. So I want to learn more about that. A few of her papers and papers referencing her are held by the Library of Congress. So I'm hoping to be able to go there and dig a little bit more. With things being closed right now, it's a little bit sometimes hard to get some of that information. So probably my favorite finds while I was researching, I mentioned it really briefly, but her being attached to birth control in 1916 is fascinating. She just kind of pops up in the most interesting places. So that was always really fun. I found when I was researching, I didn't have a good place to include it, but there's in a newspaper in New York, I believe in maybe 1914, 1912. There's a little note that says Mrs. David C. Fisher and daughter, which would be Ruth, visit Mrs. William Talbert in Buffalo. So she and her mother apparently went to visit Mary Burnett Talbert in Buffalo. So connecting those two women, I'd spent so much time researching that little connection. Empirically, I knew they probably had a connection, but finding that in a little tiny blurb in a 19 teens paper was very exciting. I think I made a really loud noise when I found that. That was really exciting. Oh, the sculpture. Carly asked about the sculpture that I mentioned that's particularly interesting. So that's Edmonia Lewis's statue of Cleopatra that is held by the Smithsonian. It was thought to be lost for a really long time, and then it was rediscovered. It was actually used, I believe, as a cemetery sculpture, and I'd have to look it up because I don't remember all the details, but something about it being part of a racetrack in Chicago. It just had a very interesting journey from Edmonia Lewis's workshop to ending up in the Smithsonian. Do we have any other questions?
I just put a link up for the Smithsonian's website webpage about the death of Cleopatra sculpture in the chat feature.
If you really get sucked down that Edmonia Lewis research rabbit hole, the story behind the photograph of her taken in Rome, which is held by the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, is also really interesting. It was found, if I remember correctly, by one of their curators at an antique shop while this curator was on sabbatical. She was flipping through a stack of these postcards with people's pictures on them and looks down and recognizes Edmonia Lewis. Unfortunately, it seems like a lot of photographs of her are actually currently up for auction, so not currently in the public domain. There's some really charming ones that I really wanted to include that I feel like really kind of show off her personality, but obviously we weren't able to get access to those. So what will OHC do with my research? So hopefully it will be added to the wonderful people files that they hold in their collection. I believe we're going to be putting this up on YouTube, so hopefully we can, present that again. So it's kind of being added to the great body of research and work that the Heritage Center does.
Okay, well, I think unless there are any other final questions or comments, I think we are going to say good evening to everyone and thank you again for participating.